The night was quiet, yet something about it felt heavy, as if the world was holding its breath. Keanu Reeves walked down a narrow street after a long day of filming. The city lights reflected on the wet pavement and his footsteps echoed softly. He had always been a private man, carrying his silence like a shield. But tonight he carried a different weight. In the middle of his busy life, he often wondered if people really saw him for who he was, or if they only saw the image they wanted him to be. Far away, Sandra Bullock sat in her kitchen, a cup of tea resting between her palms. She stared at the steam rising from it, lost in thoughts that carried both joy and sorrow. She remembered the times on set when laughter had filled the air, when moments felt light, and when people's hearts seemed more open. But she also remembered nights like this, when fame felt like a wall rather than a bridge. Years ago, their paths had crossed, not just as co-stars, but as two souls quietly learning to trust. It was not about romance or headlines. It was about respect, kindness, and a rare understanding. Psychologists often say that true bonds are built not by constant words, but by the silence that two people can share without discomfort. And that was what they had, an unspoken trust. Keanu often carried a sense of loss, shadows of his past never too far away. Yet Sandra had a way of softening those edges. She never asked too much, never forced him to explain. She simply stood by, with warmth in her eyes that told him he was safe. And in return, he reminded her that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it is quiet, steady, and patient. The world saw them as Hollywood stars. Cameras followed, interviews replayed, stories twisted. But what the world did not see was the moment when Sandra once sat beside Keanu on a late-night set, when he looked too tired to speak, and she simply placed a sandwich by his side without saying a word. He had smiled faintly, and in that small moment, an invisible bond tightened. That bond was not loud. It was not full of grand gestures. It was like the steady flame of a candle, small but constant, holding back the dark. But bonds like these are often tested by life in ways that cannot be predicted. One evening, Sandra received a call that shook her. It was not about her own life, but about someone close to her, someone who had been carrying silent battles that no one had noticed. She hung up the phone, her hands trembling, her thoughts racing. For a moment, the room seemed to close in around her. Without hesitation, she dialed a number she had memorized long ago. Keanu answered with his usual calm, but she heard the shift in his voice when he realized she was struggling to speak. He did not ask for details right away. He only said softly, "I am here. Tell me where you are." Within an hour, he was at her door. The city outside kept moving, cars passing, lives unfolding, but in that small kitchen, time seemed to pause. Sandra sat at the table again, her tea now cold, her eyes fixed on the floor. Keanu quietly pulled out a chair and sat across from her. He did not push her to explain. He simply gave her presence, a reminder that she was not carrying the weight alone. Finally, her voice cracked as she whispered what had happened. She spoke of pain, of fear for someone she loved, of the helplessness that came when all her fame and success meant nothing in the face of human struggle. Tears filled her eyes, not the kind that begged for sympathy, but the kind that spilled when a person could no longer keep their heart locked. Keanu listened, really listened. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers, his silence filled with understanding. When she finished, when the room had grown heavy with emotion, he reached across the table and gently placed his hand over hers. It was a simple gesture, but in it there was strength. "You are not alone," he said softly. Those words did not fix everything, but they steadied her heart. In that moment, she realized why their bond felt so different. It was not about being perfect or strong all the time. It was about being real, being present, being human. Psychologists explain that trust grows when one person shows vulnerability and the other responds with kindness instead of judgment. This night was proof of that truth. As the hours passed, they shared stories they had never spoken before. They spoke about fear, about the cost of always being in the public eye, about the quiet ache of loneliness that sometimes crept in despite the noise of fame. Yet they also spoke about small joys, about laughter that had saved them in the hardest of times, and about the resilience that came from holding on to hope. When dawn arrived, A faint golden light slipped through the window, painting the room with warmth. Sandra looked at Keanu and felt gratitude, not just for his presence, but for the reminder that even in a world filled with uncertainty, there are people who choose to stand by you when you need them most. What began as a night of sorrow ended as a moment of connection so deep that it would stay with them for years. It was the kind of moment that could not be scripted, could not be staged, and could not be faked. It was real, and that reality was what made their bond so unshakable. As Sandra poured fresh tea, her hands no longer trembling, she glanced at Keanu and said quietly, "Thank you for being here." He gave her the same faint smile he had given years ago on set, the one that carried more meaning than words could capture. "Always," he replied. And with that, the story of their bond took another turn, one that would continue to surprise, inspire, and remind the world that kindness, respect, and quiet resilience are more powerful than anyone realizes. The morning sun had barely risen when Sandra Bullock found herself still sitting at the kitchen table. The golden light slipped in gently, softening the heaviness that had filled the room just hours ago. Keanu Reeves was still there, quiet and steady, sipping his tea as if he had all the time in the world. It was not the kind of silence that felt awkward. It was the kind that carried calmness, the kind that told her she did not need to perform or pretend. Yet beneath that calm, both of them knew something had shifted. Sandra had let him see a part of her that she rarely showed anyone, and Keanu had responded with a kind of presence that went beyond words. It was not dramatic. It was not loud, but it was real. "You should rest," Keanu said softly, noticing the tiredness in her eyes. "I can't," she whispered. "My mind won't stop." He nodded, understanding without needing her to explain. He knew what it was like to carry thoughts that refused to quiet down. Thoughts that visited in the middle of the night and stayed long after the world had woken up. As the day moved forward, Sandra tried to distract herself. She answered a few calls, checked emails, even forced herself to eat breakfast, but nothing seemed to lift the weight. Keanu stayed close. Not as a guest who overstayed, but as someone who seemed naturally meant to be there. He fixed small things in her kitchen, made sure she drank water, even played with her dog who wagged its tail around him as if sensing his calm spirit. But the stillness of that day was broken when her phone rang again. This time her heart dropped before she even answered. She knew it was connected to the pain she had shared the night before. The voice on the other end spoke fast, words heavy with worry. Sandra listened, her face tightening, her fingers clutching the phone so hard her knuckles turned white. Keanu watched, his calm eyes narrowing slightly as he picked up on her distress. When she finally ended the call, she sat down, unable to find her voice for a moment. "They need me," she said finally, her voice low and strained. "They need me right now." Without hesitation, Keanu stood up. "Then we go." Those words were simple, but the way he said them left no room for doubt. It was not a question. It was a promise. The drive across the city was long, the streets crowded with people rushing through their day. Sandra sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her thoughts racing. Every sound felt sharper, every second heavier. Keanu drove steadily, his hands firm on the wheel, his presence steady beside her. At one point, she broke the silence. "I don't know if I can handle this." Keanu glanced at her briefly, his voice calm. "You don't have to handle it alone." Those words landed deeply, reminding her again of why his presence mattered. He had a way of cutting through her fears without trying to solve everything, without pretending to have answers. Instead, he offered something even stronger: partnership. When they finally arrived, the place carried an air of quiet despair. It was not a hospital, though it felt almost as heavy. It was a rehabilitation center, where people battled invisible wars of the mind and heart. Sandra's loved one had been admitted after a breakdown that no one had seen coming. Walking through those doors, Sandra felt her chest tighten. Memories rushed in. Laughter, moments of joy, shared dreams, and now to see someone she loved in such a fragile state was almost unbearable. Keanu walked beside her, not a step ahead, not a step behind. He matched her pace as if he knew she needed balance. When they entered the room, the sight before her broke her heart. The person she loved looked smaller, almost lost, sitting by the window with a faraway gaze. For a moment, Sandra froze. Her throat tightened, her legs felt heavy. But Keanu gently touched her arm, grounding her, reminding her to breathe. She walked forward slowly, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I'm here." The loved one turned, eyes tired but softening slightly at the sight of her. There were no dramatic reunions, no sudden smiles, just the quiet recognition of someone who mattered. Keanu stayed back, giving them space, but his presence filled the room. He stood near the doorway, hands in his pockets, his gaze steady. He was not intruding, yet he was ready to step in if needed. The conversation that followed was raw and painful. Sandra listened as her loved one spoke of struggles hidden behind forced smiles, of nights filled with silence that felt like cages, of fear that no one could understand. Sandra's tears fell freely, but she did not look away. She held their hand tightly, promising that they were not alone anymore. When her voice faltered, when her strength began to shake, Keanu stepped closer. He did not speak to fill the silence. Instead, he looked at her loved one with a calm kindness that said more than words. "You are not broken," he said finally, his voice steady. "You are human. And being human means sometimes we fall, but it also means we can stand again." Those words hung in the air, simple yet powerful. Sandra's loved one blinked, as if trying to hold on to them. For the first time that day, a small spark of hope flickered in their tired eyes. After they left the center, Sandra felt drained, but also strangely lighter. Walking to the car, she turned to Keanu. "How do you do it?" she asked softly. "How do you stay so calm?" He thought for a moment before answering. "I've lived through storms. Some I thought would break me. But I learned that when you can't control the storm, you stand steady. Sometimes that's all you can do. And sometimes that's enough." Those words stayed with her, circling in her mind as they drove back through the city lights. That night, as Sandra lay in bed, she realized something she had never fully admitted to herself. Her bond with Keanu was not just about friendship. It was about survival, about finding someone who reminded her of her own strength when she forgot it. It was about trust that could not be shaken by distance, fame, or time. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning of a journey that would test them in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The following days unfolded with a rhythm that felt strange to Sandra. Life outside her home looked the same. People rushing to work, cameras flashing at events, scripts waiting for her attention. But inside, everything felt changed. The visit to the rehabilitation center had left her shaken, but it had also opened her eyes to the quiet strength she carried and the way Keanu's presence held her steady when her world felt unstable. Keanu remained close in those days, not in a way that overwhelmed her, but like a constant shadow, steady and patient. Sometimes he came by early in the morning with coffee, saying nothing more than, "Thought you might need this." Other times, he joined her on long walks through quiet neighborhoods where no one bothered them, where they could simply exist without masks or roles. But what struck Sandra most was his ability to listen. She had worked in an industry where everyone spoke loudly, where stories were often twisted to shine brighter, where silence was filled with noise. Yet with Keanu, silence itself felt like a friend. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky with orange and pink, Sandra sat on her porch with Keanu beside her. She found herself speaking about her childhood, about the times when she had felt invisible, about the pressure she had carried even as a young girl to always keep smiling. She told him how sometimes she still carried that little girl inside her, the one afraid of disappointing everyone. Keanu listened, his gaze steady on the fading light. When she finished, he nodded gently. "I understand," he said softly. "I've felt invisible too. But sometimes being invisible teaches you to see others more clearly." Those words sank into her heart. She realized then that part of what made their bond so real was that both of them carried pieces of loneliness, and instead of hiding them, they shared them. But life has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. A few days later, the media caught sight of them together outside the rehabilitation center. Photographs spread quickly, headlines crafted wild stories. And suddenly, the private struggle became a public conversation. Sandra woke to flashing notifications on her phone. News sites speculated about her personal life, about Keanu's involvement, about details that were no one's business. She scrolled through the words with a tightening chest. She had faced gossip before, but this felt cruel because it involved someone she loved, someone already in pain. When Keanu arrived that morning, she pushed the phone across the table to him, frustration in her voice. "Look at this. They make it into something it's not. They don't care who they hurt." Keanu read the headlines calmly, his expression unchanged. When he looked up, his voice was steady. "Let them talk. The truth isn't in their words. The truth is in what you live." But Sandra shook her head. "It's not just about me. This affects my family. It affects someone who's already struggling." Keanu leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers. "Then we stand taller. We protect them not by fighting every rumor, but by staying grounded in what's real." His calmness should have reassured her, but part of Sandra burned with anger. She had always been protective, and the thought of strangers twisting her pain into entertainment felt unbearable. That evening, when she visited her loved one again, she found them quieter than before, withdrawn, their eyes filled with shame. They had seen the headlines, too. "I'm so sorry," Sandra whispered, holding their hand tightly. "None of this should have happened." "You don't deserve this." Her loved ones shook their heads slowly. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I am just weak." Those words cut deep. Before Sandra could respond, Keanu, who had been standing quietly in the corner, stepped forward. His voice was firm but gentle. "No, weakness is giving up. Weakness is pretending you don't care. What you're doing, facing this, admitting your pain, that is strength. Don't let anyone take that from you." The room fell silent. Sandra's loved ones stared at him, eyes moist but softer now. A small nod followed, almost imperceptible, but real. That night, on the drive back, Sandra sat quietly, her emotions tangled. Finally, she turned to Keanu. "How do you always know what to say?" He gave a faint smile. "I don't. I just say what I wish someone had told me when I needed it." Sandra's chest tightened at his words. She knew his past was marked with loss, pain that could have broken anyone else. Yet here he was, using that pain not as a barrier, but as a bridge to reach others. As the days turned into weeks, the challenges continued. The media would not stop. Every small outing brought speculation. Sandra's career demanded her attention, pulling her into interviews and meetings where she had to smile while carrying heavy worry inside. And Keanu, though steady, faced his own storms, offers for roles that came with pressures, directors pushing him into the spotlight he often resisted. One evening, after a particularly long day, Sandra found herself sitting with Keanu once again, this time on a rooftop overlooking the city. The lights below sparkled like stars, but she felt far from peace. "Sometimes I think it's too much," she admitted, her voice low. "The pressure, the eyes on us, the constant noise. I wonder if I can keep doing this." Keanu looked out at the city, then back at her. "Then don't do it for them. Do it for yourself. Do it for the ones you love. Let the noise be noise. It will fade." She stared at him for a long moment, realizing again why his presence mattered. He never told her what she wanted to hear. He told her what she needed to remember. Their bond, though tested, grew stronger in the fire of those weeks. Psychologists often say real trust is built not in comfort but in struggle. And for Keanu and Sandra, the struggle was not over, but already it was shaping something unbreakable. And somewhere deep inside, both of them sensed that the biggest test was yet to come. The weeks passed, and though the noise of the media had not fully faded, Sandra and Keanu learned to move within it as if walking through a storm with quiet determination. Still, storms have a way of leaving marks, and behind their calm appearances, both carried the weight of what had unfolded. Sandra often found herself waking in the middle of the night, her chest heavy, her mind filled with worry for her loved one. She would walk to the kitchen, pour herself a glass of water, and stare at the darkness outside. Sometimes, without even calling, Keanu would appear the next morning with quiet eyes and steady hands, as if he somehow knew she had not slept well. Their connection began to deepen in ways that neither of them had planned. They started sharing more of their hidden selves, stories they had never told anyone else. Keanu spoke of his moments of grief, of the times he felt like the world had given him more pain than he could hold, yet how he had learned to carry it by focusing on kindness. Sandra spoke of her fear of not being enough, of feeling like she was always performing, even off camera, and how sometimes she longed for a space where she could just be. One evening, as they sat in her living room, Sandra said softly, "You make me feel like I don't have to explain myself. Do you know how rare that is?" Keanu looked at her quietly, his expression unreadable at first. Then he gave a faint smile. "Maybe because I don't expect you to be anything but you." Those words sank into her heart with a surprising force. For a moment, she felt tears rising, not from sadness, but from the relief of being seen. But just as their bond was strengthening, another challenge came without warning. Sandra received a call from her agent, an urgent opportunity for a new film, one that could redefine her career. The role was powerful, complex, and deeply emotional, but it came with a catch. The filming would take her away for months across the world, far from her family, far from the rehabilitation center where her loved one was still recovering. When she hung up the call, she felt torn in two directions. Her heart wanted to stay, to protect, to be present for the ones she loved. But her mind whispered that this role could be a once-in-a-lifetime chance, one she could not simply walk away from. That night, she shared the news with Keanu as they walked in the quiet of her garden. The air was cool, carrying the soft scent of flowers, but her thoughts were heavy. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "If I leave, I feel like I'm abandoning them. But if I stay, I feel like I'm abandoning myself." Keanu walked silently for a moment, his hands tucked into his pockets. Then he said, "Maybe it's not about abandoning. Maybe it's about trusting. Trusting that the people you love are stronger than you think, and trusting that you're allowed to choose your path too." His words comforted her, but they also scared her. Trusting meant letting go, and letting go had always been the hardest part for her. The next day, she visited her loved one again. The rehabilitation center felt different this time, lighter, as if small rays of hope had started to slip through the cracks of despair. When she told them about the opportunity, she expected anger or disappointment. Instead, they surprised her with a weak but genuine smile. "You should do it," they whispered. "You've always told me not to let fear hold me back. Don't let worry hold you back either. I'll be okay." Sandra's eyes filled with tears. It was as if her loved one, despite their own struggles, had found strength she had not expected. On the drive home, she sat in silence, staring out at the city lights. Keanu finally asked, "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "that sometimes the people we think need us the most end up teaching us the lessons we need instead." Keanu nodded, his eyes soft with understanding. "That's the beauty of resilience. It spreads." Still, the decision weighed heavily. Days passed, and Sandra wrestled with doubts. She confided in Keanu often, her voice filled with uncertainty. "What if I regret this? What if I choose wrong?" Keanu leaned back one evening, looking at her with quiet intensity. "You will never regret following your heart. Even if it hurts, even if it's messy, following your heart is always the right choice." Those words, simple as they were, echoed inside her. Finally, she agreed to the role. The choice did not erase her fear, but it gave her a strange kind of courage. She knew it would not be easy, but she also knew she could not keep living torn between two worlds without moving forward. The night before she left for the shoot, Sandra sat outside with Keanu under the stars. The air was cool, the world unusually quiet. She looked at him and whispered, "Thank you for everything. I don't think I could have faced any of this without you." Keanu's gaze stayed on the stars as he replied, "You could have. You're stronger than you think, but I'm glad you didn't have to do it alone." Sandra smiled faintly, her heart swelling with gratitude. As dawn approached, she packed her bags, ready to step into a new chapter. But neither of them knew that her decision would set off a chain of events far more difficult than they had imagined. For sometimes, when you move forward, life tests how much strength you truly carry. And for Sandra and Keanu, the real test was only beginning. The first days of filming were overwhelming for Sandra. The set was in a country far from home, surrounded by mountains that touched the clouds and villages that whispered old stories through their narrow streets. The role she had accepted demanded everything from her: tears, vulnerability, strength, and silence. Each scene felt like it was peeling away layers of herself. At night, when she returned to her hotel room, she often found herself staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had made the right choice. Yet even across the distance, Keanu remained close. He called her in the evenings, sometimes with only a few words. "How are you holding up?" he would ask. And she would answer honestly, knowing he did not want the polished version of her truth. Sometimes she confessed her exhaustion, sometimes her fears, and sometimes she spoke about small joys: the kindness of the local crew, the beauty of the sunrise, the way laughter still found its way on set. Back home, her loved one continued recovery. Updates came slowly, carried through calls with family, sometimes hopeful, sometimes heavy. One night, after a particularly draining day of filming, Sandra received a message that shook her. Her loved one had faced a setback, a sudden wave of despair that nearly undid weeks of progress. Her hands trembled as she held the phone. Tears blurred her vision, and for a moment she felt powerless, stranded across oceans, while someone she loved struggled. She called Keanu immediately. His voice, calm as always, filled the silence. "Breathe," he said softly. "You can't be everywhere at once. You're doing your best, Sandra. That has to be enough. But what if it's not?" she whispered. "What if me being here is hurting them?" Keanu's pause carried weight. Then he said, "Sometimes love means stepping back, trusting that they can rise on their own. You can't carry every storm for them. You can only walk beside them." Those words steadied her, but they did not erase the ache. The next day on set, Sandra poured her pain into her performance. The camera captured her trembling hands, her broken voice, her raw emotions. When the director called cut, there was silence on the set. Not from failure, but from awe. Her vulnerability had touched everyone in the room. Later, in her dressing room, Sandra sat alone, tears still streaming down her face. She realized something then, that art and life often mirrored one another. The role she was playing was not just a job. It was a reflection of her own struggles, her own fears, her own resilience. Back home, Keanu visited the rehabilitation center often in her absence. He did not tell Sandra everything he did, but word reached her through family. He had quietly sat with her loved one during meals, encouraged them during therapy, and sometimes simply walked with them in the garden. He never tried to replace her presence, but he became a quiet anchor, ensuring they never felt abandoned. When Sandra heard this, her chest tightened with gratitude. One evening, during their call, she whispered, "Why do you do so much, Keanu? Why do you always step in when I can't?" His voice was gentle, almost hesitant. "Because I know what it feels like to need someone and find no one there. I promised myself I'd never let the people I care about feel that way." Sandra sat in silence, her heart heavy with both sorrow and admiration. She understood now more than ever why their bond felt unshakable. It was not built on glamour or headlines. It was built on wounds, kindness, and the quiet decision to show up when it mattered most. Weeks passed and filming grew harder. The role demanded deeper emotions, pulling her into places she rarely allowed herself to go. Yet every time she felt like she was breaking, a call from Keanu or an update about her loved one's progress reminded her that strength was not about never falling. It was about rising again even with trembling hands. Then, near the end of filming, a letter arrived at her hotel. It was from her loved one. The handwriting was shaky, but the words were steady. "Dear Sandra, I want you to know I am fighting, not just for me, but for you. You once told me that light comes through even in the darkest cracks. I hold on to that every day. Keanu has been here, reminding me that I matter. And I realize now that I do. Don't worry about me. Live your story. I'll live mine too." Sandra clutched the letter to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She read it over and over, each line sinking into her soul. For the first time in weeks, she felt a deep breath of relief. That night, during her call with Keanu, she read the letter aloud. When she finished, there was silence on the line. Then Keanu said softly, "See, they are stronger than you thought. You just needed to believe it. Sandra smiled through her tears. "You were right," she whispered. As the film neared completion, Sandra realized that this chapter of her life had become more than just a professional journey. It was a personal awakening. She had learned that strength was not about holding everyone together at once. It was about trusting, letting go, and allowing love to move through others too. But just when things began to feel lighter, a new shadow appeared on the horizon. An unexpected call came late one night, one that would once again test the bond between her and Keanu, pushing both of them into choices that would change everything. The night was quiet when the call came. Sandra was still overseas, the film only weeks from wrapping up when her phone buzzed in the dark. At first, she thought it was just another update, maybe even good news. But as soon as she heard the voice on the other end, her body froze. Her loved one had gone missing from the rehabilitation center. No one knew where they had gone, only that they had walked out in the early evening and never returned. The staff had searched. The police had been alerted, but hours had passed with no sign of them. Sandra's chest tightened. Fear gripped her in a way she had never felt before. She sat up in bed, her hands trembling, her breath unsteady. For a moment, the world spun around her. Without thinking, she called Keanu. His voice, calm but sharper than usual, answered almost instantly. When she told him, there was silence, then the sound of him moving quickly. "I'll find them," he said simply. "Keanu, what if—" she began, her voice breaking. "Don't go there," he interrupted firmly but gently. "Hold on to hope. I'll call you the moment I know something." And just like that, he was gone, already out into the night searching, while Sandra sat miles away. Helpless in her hotel room, Keanu moved through the city streets. He checked the small parks, the quiet corners, the bus stops where someone might sit lost in thought. He asked questions gently, showing a photo, always with calm respect. Most people did not recognize him in the dim light, and those who did never guessed why he was out there. Hours passed, but Keanu did not stop. His steady steps carried him into places most would avoid at night, dim alleys, crowded shelters, forgotten corners of the city. He moved with patience, as if he knew that finding someone in pain required more than rushing. It required presence, and the quiet persistence of refusing to give up. Meanwhile, Sandra sat with her phone in her hands, tears rolling down her face. She replayed every memory, every conversation, every moment she wished she had done more. The thought of losing her loved one clawed at her heart. She whispered into the empty room, "Please, just let them be safe." Then, near dawn, her phone rang again. She answered with shaking hands. "I found them," Keanu said softly. Her body collapsed with relief, tears streaming freely now. "Where? Are they okay?" "They're tired, scared, but safe," he replied. "I'm with them now. We're sitting in a small cafe. They didn't want to go back yet, so I'm just listening, giving them space." Sandra's heart swelled with gratitude and sorrow all at once. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you for being there when I can't." In the cafe, Keanu sat across from the person he had been searching for all night. Their eyes were red, their hands trembling around the cup of tea he had bought them. "I didn't want to be a burden anymore," they whispered. Keanu leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "You are not a burden. You are human. And being human means sometimes we need others to remind us that we matter. You matter." The words sank into the silence between them. Slowly, their breathing calmed, their shoulders eased. Later, when they returned to the rehabilitation center, Keanu stayed until he was sure they were safe. He sat quietly in the hallway, watching as they finally fell asleep in their room, the exhaustion of despair replaced by fragile rest. When he called Sandra again, he spoke gently. "They'll be okay, but they'll need patience, and so will you." Sandra pressed the phone to her chest after the call ended, her tears silent now. She knew Keanu had not just saved her loved one that night, he had saved her too, from drowning in fear miles away. A week later, the film wrapped, and Sandra flew home. When she saw Keanu waiting at the airport, she rushed to him, hugging him tightly, unable to hold back her tears. He held her with the same quiet strength he had always given. No words needed. That evening, she visited her loved one. They were fragile, yes, but they smiled when they saw her. A small but powerful smile that told her there was still light to be found. Later that night, as Sandra and Keanu sat together again on her porch, she looked at him and said softly, "I don't know how to thank you." He shook his head. "You don't have to. That's what trust is. That's what bonds are for." She looked at him for a long moment, realizing how rare it was to have someone like him in her life. Someone who did not demand, did not judge, did not disappear when things grew heavy. Instead, he stayed. Psychologists often say that real trust is tested in moments of crisis, and this night had proven once again that their bond was unshakable. Yet even as the quiet returned, both of them knew the journey was not over. Storms could return, tests could rise again. But what they had built, through pain, through silence, through resilience, was something stronger than either of them had expected. And in the stillness of that night, Sandra finally allowed herself to believe it. They were not just surviving anymore. They were growing, together. The days after Sandra's return carried a strange mix of heaviness and light. Her loved one continued their healing step by step, and though progress was slow, there was progress. Every small smile, every calm conversation, every walk in the garden felt like a victory. Sandra held on to these moments as tightly as she could, knowing how fragile they were, but also how precious. Keanu remained by her side in the quiet way he always had. Sometimes he stayed in the background, fixing small things around the house or cooking meals without being asked. Other times he sat with Sandra in silence, giving her space when her emotions grew too heavy to put into words. He never demanded thanks, never asked for recognition. His presence itself was the gift. But one evening, Sandra finally let the words spill out. They were sitting on her porch again, the sky painted with deep shades of purple as the sun fell away. Her loved one had gone to bed early, resting peacefully, and for the first time in weeks, the house felt calm. She turned to Keanu, her voice low and unsteady. "Do you realize what you've done for me? For my family? I don't think I could have carried this without you." He looked at her for a long moment before replying. "You carried more than you think. I was just walking beside you." Her eyes filled with tears. "No, it's more than that. You showed me what it means to trust. You showed me that being strong doesn't mean carrying everything alone. It means allowing someone else to hold the weight when you can't." Keanu gave a faint smile, one of those rare smiles that seemed to carry both sadness and warmth. "Then maybe we've both learned the same thing. Because you've reminded me that even after loss, even after darkness, connection is still possible. Trust is still possible." Their words lingered in the cool air, simple but heavy with meaning. The weeks turned into months. Sandra's loved one grew stronger, finding new courage to face the future. Some days were difficult, filled with setbacks and doubts, but now there was a foundation of hope beneath the struggle. They no longer felt alone in their pain. Sandra, too, felt herself changing. She no longer looked at her career with the same hunger for perfection. Instead, she approached it with honesty, bringing more of her true self into her work. Interviews became less about image and more about authenticity. She laughed more, even in public, no longer afraid of how she looked when she wasn't perfect. And through it all, Keanu remained, not as a savior, not as someone who solved everything, but as someone who proved, day after day, that real bonds are built not by grand gestures, but by consistent presence, quiet loyalty, and kindness that expects nothing in return. One night, months later, Sandra hosted a small dinner at her home. Her loved one sat at the table, healthier now, their eyes brighter. Laughter filled the room, soft and unforced. Sandra looked across the table and caught Keanu's eyes. He gave her that same faint smile, and in it, she saw everything they had survived together. After everyone had gone to bed, Sandra and Keanu stepped outside once more, standing beneath the stars. The air was cool, the night silent except for the gentle rustle of leaves. "Do you ever wonder?" Sandra asked softly. "Why our bond feels different from everything else?" Keanu looked up at the stars for a long time before answering. "Because it's real. It's not built on what people expect. It's built on respect, on kindness, on choosing to show up when it matters. And real things, they last." Sandra nodded, her heart full. For years, she had searched for something solid in a world that often felt like shifting sand. Now standing there beside him, she realized she had found it. Their bond was not about headlines or stories. It was not about fame or careers. It was about humanity, the kind that remains steady through storms, the kind that heals quietly, the kind that endures. Psychologists say that the deepest trust is not formed in words but in actions. And through every silence, every crisis, every act of kindness, Sandra and Keanu had proven this truth. As they stood together in the quiet night, Sandra whispered, "Whatever comes next, I know I won't face it alone." Keanu's eyes softened. "Neither will I." And with that, their story, though far from over in life, found its place in the hearts of those who would hear it. A reminder that respect, humility, resilience, and kindness are not just words. They are choices that can bind two souls together in ways that feel unshakably real.